Paid for by A Common America. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. Learn more at www.acommonamerica.org.
Welcome to another episode of A Common America, the podcast. If you're joining us for the first time, a special welcome to you. We are A Common America. Today on our podcast, we feature the first in the series that we call Common Ground. Our topic today is gun violence, a topic upon which the vast majority of Americans agree more needs to be done. We will dive into how it has impacted each of us and what we would like to see for the future. But first, let's recap the event that just recently occurred in Kansas City.
As Mark mentioned, on countless occasions, gun violence has marred and devastated America through fatal shootings in schools, places of worship, the grocery store, concerts, the list goes on. The recent Superbowl parade in Missouri became no exception when shots were fired during the celebratory event. Lisa Galvan-Lopez lost her life, and over 20 adults and children were injured. As of today, March 5th, 2024, the Gun Violence Archive has reported the following. There have been 70 mass shootings, 45 children killed, 238 unintentional shootings, and 4,917 injuries. And that's just for 2024. While the Gun Violence Archives aren't that optimistic, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health released their 2023 national survey, which does provide a ray of hope. The survey's findings include that 81% of Americans overall support prohibiting a person subject to a temporary domestic violence restraining order from having a gun for the duration of the order. 72% of Americans surveyed support requiring a person to obtain a license from a local law enforcement agency before buying a gun.
When I was growing up, you just never heard of school shootings, or it seemed like it was an even bigger deal when it did occur because it was so infrequent, or it was so infrequently talked about. But now I think parents think about things differently. People are more aware whether there are guns in other people's homes.
Was Columbine the first school shooting that you remember?
There were some, but they weren't to the extent that that was planned and how devastating it was. Even at my age, I don't recall a lot of them being that massive and destructive.
It's interesting to see Ethan Crumbley, where his parents were also taken to trial over it and charged. And I think that's one of the first cases where they tried to flee to. I think that's a pretty big shift that we're seeing for some states where parents would be liable for what they knew. There was that other case of the mother who turned her son in before it could happen. That would be really devastating as a parent. I just can't imagine being in that position.
I noticed Missouri is in the process or just completed a new gun law that allows people to carry in churches and on the bus. A lot of gun advocates say it would be better if there were more guns when these things happen, and they're actually pushing for carry in churches because we've seen a couple of incidents in churches in the last few years as well. So that's the direction they're pushing, not the other way.
But you also can't go around, I don't want to become agoraphobic, and I don't want to become a hermit. I want to be able to enjoy my life and concerts and events where there are people, but it's always in the back of my mind. Being shot at the grocery store, at your job, at a concert, anywhere, church,
well,
anywhere.
Think of where hasn't one of these occurrences been? I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, I can't think of any place we haven't had a mass shooting as far as a location goes. Yeah, as you said, concerts, Vegas, churches, malls, schools, obviously. It's everywhere. And the thing is, after we had all these shootings occurring for the last, we're kind of talking about the last 20 years or so, it's going up at an alarming rate every year. And yet last year and the year before, many red states changed their requirements to be more lenient. It's crazy to me anyway.
What are some of the first occurrences of this that are imprinted in your memory?
I think Columbine is still the one where it seems so beyond belief. It wasn't someone who was just something happened in the moment. It was planned ahead. It was a very disturbing, the entire situation was disturbing, and all the death that occurred and the injuries. That's probably still the first one that really stands out in my mind. I hate to say that because there's shootings before that were very important, obviously, but Sandy Hook is another one that, because of the age of the children or ages of the children, was just so devastating, and the number of kids that died and teachers. Those are the two that stand out in my mind.
Brianna, did you have any that kind of stood out in your mind?
For sure, Columbine. I graduated high school in 2007, so there was a good gap from when Columbine happened. But we were also the generation that had a ton of school shooter drills regularly, all the time, you know. So it definitely had that trickle down effect. And watching the documentaries about it, there's something super chilling about that one. I don't really know what it is either in comparison to the others, but there's something really unnerving about that one. I think maybe it has to do with the planning that went into it, the manifesto. You know, I think that adds to it quite a bit. And just feeling like going into high school, and that was still felt very fresh for a lot of people, that we were very like scared about it and warned about it, and the drills that we went through. I mean, now they're so different. The drills that they go through are so different from what we went through, which is like lock the door, pull down the shade, everybody get in the furthest corner from the door, you know. But now it's like, how can you barricade it? You know, it's just very, very different.
Are you both having the same feeling I'm having, which is I feel guilty because I can't remember. And then I start thinking there's been so many shootings that it's incredible how many there have been and the rate at which they're going up. I think we've already had over 200 shootings this year. Yeah, it's insane. And I feel guilty. All these people, you know, 5 people died, 30 people died in Vegas, even more. And I can't remember the details of it just because, you know, loss of life, I want to remember all those details, but I just can't because the volume's just so high. It's horrible.
The other one that sticks with me, in college, I was a resident hall advisor, like dorm counselor in the dorms. The first year that I was a resident advisor, the next dorm over, some kid on the floor took a shotgun, went to his dorm advisor, resident hall advisor's door. We had no peepholes in the dorm doors. People would knock and you just open. And the kid knocked on the door. The dorm advisor opened the door and the kid shot him. It was the very next door dorm. It was my first year doing this job. I remember that happening, and it made such an impact on me. It's the closest I've ever been to a situation like that. I remember we were locked down even though the situation was completely over. They locked down because they didn't know what was going on. It took them a while to piece together what had actually occurred. And then that same year they came through and they installed the peepholes on the doors and everything changed. But being so close to it, it's definitely scarring. It's crazy to think about.
Yeah, I was doing a little additional research, and I was on Gifford's website, and they have a couple stats. And one of them is that annually 43,000 people in America die from gun violence. So it's not 1,000, it's not 2,000, it's 43,000. And in the last decade, 1 million people have been shot in the U.S. It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And no one's, well, I should say, many people are preventing us from fixing it.
Yeah, it's definitely the gun control versus gun rights argument. That's what it always comes down to.
Usually the Republicans come out after shooting and say, prayers and prayers. They go out to the people and that's it every time. And now I'm seeing the Missouri head of the state legislature. They say, well, this is a horrible situation we're in, but no gun regulation could have prevented this particular episode, which I think is really interesting. That's their new way to say that, hey, we don't need to pass legislation. You're all upset about the shooting. We understand that, but let's not jump to any new laws right away. But this would not have prevented that. And what's interesting about that argument is that if you look at the other research that's been done by many organizations in the country, that you do see that gun laws prevent murders and gun violence. Everyone shows it, that it goes down significantly. California has 1/3 the rate that Missouri does. And so for them to say that every time in that particular instance, because of whatever no one could have gotten there in time or whatever it might be, that needs to be addressed at the state level and the federal level, which is obviously why we're sitting here talking today. So I don't know, it's just very frustrating.
Seems like one other thing that they talked about was what the speaker-elect was talking about. We need to look at gun legislation. We need to look at mental health legislation. We need to look at this issue from multiple sides. At least that's how I read the feedback.
From Jonathan Patterson, yeah. A little bit. I'll admit, when I first saw the quote there that was we should be willing to look at gun policy, social policy, mental health policies, public safety, and crime policy to address those problems, and that he would have an open mind about advancing legislation Democrats would support. It felt like a non-answer. Like, it felt like a placeholder. I think he said that pretty shortly after the shooting, so I can get why it felt a little weak to me as a statement, which is why I kind of liked the minority leader, Crystal Quaid. And she is very specific. She's very outspoken. She came out very strong, I thought. Representative Ben Baker, he was the one who said, the fact is no law that we could pass in this body would have prevented the terrible tragedy that happened last week.
Okay, but does that mean that we shouldn't make these common sense measures that would limit other shootings from occurring? Like, we shouldn't just look at this in a vacuum as this issue, this case. We should be thinking about how we reduce the number of gun deaths every year.
It's convenient, though, to isolate it, obviously. And the interesting thing about that statement is that, in fact, in this case, it could have been different. I told you how one of the people that actually pulled out their gun and started shooting was a person who 2 years ago had pulled their gun out at a basketball game. So if you look at, access, license, as you said, permits, concealed, all the gun laws that say maybe California is, really tight, but you don't have the access. You're not going to have all these people in the crowds with guns that are either, well, maybe if they're stolen, you can't do anything about that. I get that. But you could have done something about that one gentleman who started the shooting because he'd already been a risky gun owner. They could have done something about that. And then the access probably with permits and licensing and wait periods and no loopholes to get around it, you probably reduce that gun volume out in that crowd. And so that could have had a huge impact on what happened, in my opinion anyway. Probably the biggest surprise to me was I've heard even here in Montana people talking about how gun laws don't prevent anything. They're useless. And when I saw the curve of the graph starting with California has the tightest gun laws and going down to the bottom, it was very clear that it significantly reduces gun deaths on an average basis. So that was probably the biggest surprise. I just didn't realize it was that obvious to everyone. Mm-hmm. Even when I look at some of the research lately, 70% of people, and a lot of those are gun owners, responsible gun owners, want gun control, want some reform. But if you look at what we're seeing at least in Congress and the standard phrases they're using after these shootings, they say that these new laws don't work, and they're clearly lying. They don't want the gun-wielding constituents that don't want any restrictions to hear them if they say anything different, but it's just not true. As we talked about since Columbine, gun control works. There's lots of different ways to implement it, but that's not just the licensing and permitting of the gun itself. It's also, we hear about these situations where someone was making threats and they had social media posts and they still go out and they do this and no one knew, or people knew, but the police didn't know. And there's some pretty big holes on a state-to-state basis. And as we're talking about Missouri, they have a very, very weak follow-through on people who could be potential offenders in the future. They don't, for example, if you go into a gun shop and buy a new gun, or try to buy a new gun, and you don't pass the background check, many states send that report in, and they report on this person who didn't pass, but Missouri doesn't do that. Many states don't. So it would be nice if, just as a small example, if a person who tried to come in and get a gun and did not pass the background check, that person was, the local authorities were notified of that. It's a simple step, and most states don't do it.
I just think it's so interesting and important to think about the type of weapons. Any argument that somebody would make for having an AR-15 and why people should be allowed to have AR-15s. I just can't imagine hearing somebody make a case for owning one. Really, I don't know, what I would view as a valid case.
Well, that's a good point you just made. I've heard lots of conversations about people saying they should have ownership of AR-15s. That was a valid discussion, probably not, or position. Usually what I hear from most people is that the Second Amendment is very clear that they have the right to bear arms, and they interpret that, as the NRA does, as we know, as arms, almost to the effect of any arms. Now, where is the line drawn? Is it People talk about this all the time. Is it a bazooka? Is it a tank? Is it, where's the line? And a lot of staunch NRA supporters of the Second Amendment would say there is no limitation. My personal opinion is it should be that there are civilian weapons. There's a shotgun, a rifle for hunting, and a handgun for protection. That's where it should be. Now, you could talk about the limitations of clip size and all that kind of stuff, and semi-auto versus auto, but beyond that, the AR-15 is, the newer version of the old assault rifle used for the military, and it's high capacity, high speed, and its purpose is to create as much devastation in as short a period of time as possible, and you can tell people that that's not a civilian gun. You should not have that type of a weapon in your home. And what I hear now a lot from the people that are, not a valid argument, but they say, well, I have to protect my family. And you do not need an AR-15 to protect your family. And then some people say, well, I need that to protect myself from the government. And then you're on a conversation you probably shouldn't be in anymore, and you should probably stop and move on. But a lot of people do think that they should have the right to have an assault rifle, and there's probably many responsible users of that assault rifle, but it should not be generally available to the public, even with a background check to give to anyone in some states over 18 or 21, depending.
You talked about the registry or a license or something, and states should know across borders. It's crazy because we have that system for cars and driver's licenses. And those are, that has the potential to be a deadly weapon on an individual basis or on a large number of people basis. But a gun, a weapon, there's resistance to that. The dichotomy there doesn't make any sense. It does not compute to me. The argument doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's just a lot of people who don't want the government knowing what weapons they have. And I know of many people that have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 different weapons in their home. And again, a justification, which is not valid, is that I need to protect my family. And you realize that this is a perverted interpretation of the Second Amendment for sure.
One thing I am heartened by, Chris Combs, every time there's a mass shooting, he gets his group together and they're trying to work across the aisle to find something that they can agree on that moves this issue toward a better state. They're trying to find areas that both sides of the aisle can agree on so that they can get the slimmest majority that allows them to push a bill through Congress. So should he stop doing that because he hasn't had the progress that he wants? No, he should keep doing that. It's going to take that continued effort, and his partners on the other side of the aisle should keep coming back to the table and having those conversations. Eventually something will happen and it'll change.
Yeah, I think that's true, GM. I think that the more we become conditioned to seeing this on the news, which is a horrible thing, some people don't even react to it anymore, which is awful. If I look at the polls about reasonable gun control, even basic things like getting rid of the gun show loophole or no AR-15s, things that are basic, not the 50 different things you can do, but just the basic ones. Across the country, you're seeing more people that are getting to a point, even Republicans, even gun owners are getting to a point where we need to do something about it. And so I hope that they continue to do that, because the more we see this and people feel that there's some steps, even small steps we can take to get to that 80% that we talk about often, I think it's good. I think it'll eventually happen because the graphs aren't flat, right? This is not a problem that's just going to stay at the same level. It's getting worse and worse by the year. Someone has to do something. It's just unfortunate that no one's done enough for the last 20 years, to be honest. We could have curbed some of this already, but on the right, no one wants to step in and take a hard stand and take the risk of actually not being in office next time around because they decided to do the right thing, which we've seen now. The last couple of years, we've seen some people do that, right? So I'm hopeful that even some people on the right that have historically been against any kind of conversations are going to start at least having the conversation with the Democrats and making something happen.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about what each of us can do to impact some of these issues. One of them is the petition that we've actually put on change.org. This petition is intended to stop the gridlock in DC. It's intended to get politicians to start talking to one another, to find common ground between their districts, and to actually co-sponsor bills that might get their constituents in a better position. If you could take a second to go to change.org, look up A Common America, and sign the petition that actually requires our House members to co-sponsor bills during each session, it could help us move things forward, get some common ground established between our representatives, and it could actually get people thinking and talking about how we work together in the future. So I implore you to go off to the petition, get it signed. You can actually go to our website. It's on there as well. Go sign up, get information on our newsletter, and go to change.org and sign the petition. And we really appreciate it.